Okay, so one of the first things that you might notice in this proposal is the descriptive title. So, right off the bat, we know exactly what this paper is going to be about, which is addiction to social media and how to overcome it. So, this is something that you can model your own title after, but the point that I want to get across here is that titles are specific and they don't necessarily have to be like the most catchy thing in the world. You don't have to think of it like an advertising slogan, but think about it as a specific, just specific details about what your paper is going to be discussing. So that's really what draws your audience to your writing in the first place. So one of the things that struck me when I first read this was his opener, which was using a short sentence. So if you remember back in one of our chapters in Everything's an Argument, they talk about style and they talk about sentence length. So his sentence length here, of course, is very short. And he's to the point, right? He's trying to emphasize something. So right away, he caught my attention. I was broken. I'm thinking, okay, why on earth are you broken? First of all, that's a very specific word choice to use as well. Usually someone who's broken is someone who is going through a really, really hard time and can't seem to put themselves back together. So I really like how he emphasized that in the beginning of his paper. And you also notice that he starts with using I, so we know that this is going to be a personal anecdote, which they highlight over here on the side, describing an issue, which is social media addiction. So he talks here, and I'm not going to read everything word for word, but he talks about how he got an interview, but then he didn't get in. So I hurt myself. Now, right away, I'm thinking like hurt yourself physically, but then he talks about how he succumbed to his worst instincts. I spent several hours on Facebook and Twitter looking through the society's accounts of those of its members. So he's describing to us exactly how he hurt himself. So he then goes into some very specific language here where he says, I saw the gleam of their uniforms and the casual perfection of their lives, the heads of state they greeted, and the inspirational quotations they tweeted. Social media invited me to view at a distance worlds in which I didn't belong, worlds I had been rejected from. A+ Human read a comment on a post for students who were admitted into the organization. I went to bed feeling disappointed and terrible, basically a D- human. So I love here how he kind of provides this contrast from, what he wanted to be, but then what he actually felt like. Then he says, I decided to make a change that I had pondered and abandoned time and time again, deleting the social media apps from my phone. I realized I was addicted to a virtual life I wanted but couldn't have. So a few things to point out here, first of all, that I want to draw your attention to is the narrative techniques that he utilizes in this personal anecdote. So when I say narrative techniques, what do I mean? Well, those are things like imagery. There are things that we learn about in elementary school, but we don't really pay attention to because we think that they are only found in like fiction books or kids' books, but that's not true. He's actually using imagery right here when he says, where am I going? Yeah, the gleam of their uniforms, right? The casual perfection of their lives. So I could actually like picture men in suits or uniforms when he used this language. And then also, again, using specific things like A+ human, D- human, kind of using those contrasts there. So imagery using the 5 senses, right? Contrasting language or comparisons, right? Metaphors. This was also in your style chapter, by the way, but also dialogue. And I know he didn't use that here, but another way that you can actually draw your audience in is through a story using dialogue. So that's something to point out there. Then he gets into really what his purpose is, right? And I wouldn't call this like a clear, specific thesis because he's mostly making us infer what his argument is, which is that we should delete our social media apps from our phones too. So he's kind of making a point here. I wouldn't necessarily call this like a clear and specific thesis statement. And again, it doesn't have to be at the beginning of your paper. So he might be crafting a paper where he kind of makes us infer his point. But of course, that is very hard to do. So just something to think about with the introduction. So let's go ahead and go to the second paragraph. And we'll kind of look at how he's using meal paragraphing. And hopefully we can learn some things from what he's doing here. So he starts off, apparently, I'm not alone in this predicament, struggling with an addiction to social media. So that actually is, even though it doesn't seem like it, is a very clear claim, right? He's claiming, I'm not alone in this predicament, struggling with an addiction to social media. So he's asserting that, look, I'm not the only person out here who struggles with this. And that's a pretty strong assertion, right? Then he goes into his evidence. Social media use is widespread. That's actually another claim right there. Then he goes into the Pew Research Center study, found that nearly 8 out of 10 online American adults use Facebook, and 76% of those users use the site daily. And then, of course, he has his in-text citation here. Just a note, this is an APA format, so please don't follow this as your example for citing sources. Then he says smaller but still significant percentages also use Twitter and Instagram. So again, he's paraphrasing more evidence here. Misery loves virtual company. Another strong claim. Another report, so more evidence. He talks about how 50% of people who use social apps are on them for more than 5 hours a day. And the top 20% of users spent more than 8 hours on these social apps. So again, he's using his citation here. So he has a lot of evidence, right? And he's also using a skill that we've talked about a little bit in class, which is that of synthesis. So you don't have to do it in this way. This is one way, of course, that this particular writer is putting different reports into conversation with each other, right? So he uses things like another. So there's his transition there. Another report, right? Smaller but still significant percentages also use Twitter and Instagram. So that's still him putting studies or putting authors into conversation with one another. So I think that's another really good lesson that we can take from this. Social media has come to define my generation, not only through selfies, posts, tweets, likes, and other online social activity, but also in terms of what a sinkhole it has become. So notice here, this is where he's really getting into the analysis. So he gave his studies, and now he's making a connection, right, with his generation. So again, it is personal, right, but he is also getting into deep analysis here. The distractions never end. Bottomless Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram are eerily and endlessly personalized for our own lives. Much can be said about the shallowness and corrosive effect of social media on civic life. But the most compelling argument against social media may be that it significantly hurts productivity. So his analysis here is actually transitioning into more evidence. And you can tell because he's saying maybe that it significantly hurts productivity. So we know that he didn't just come up with that on his own. So he gets into more evidence here, right? And I'll put that in a different color because that's what I've been using for evidence. And the one thing I will say that is missing here is the link. Now, this quote does a okay job of linking back to his original purpose in the beginning up here. Because really what this paragraph is about is that he's not alone in this predicament, and struggling with an addiction to social media is actually something that more people struggle with, and he gives evidence all throughout this section. But then he kind of is actually more so transitioning to the next paragraph by saying that social media significantly hurts productivity. So he says, the computer science professor and productivity expert Cal Newport wrote in a New York Times column that the ability to concentrate without distractions on hard tasks is becoming increasingly important in an increasingly complicated society. So it's a really great quote, and something that I actually do wish this writer would have done is say a little bit more about this, because I personally, I don't think it's wrong necessarily to end your paragraphs or begin your paragraphs with a quote, but it does make it a little bit difficult for the reader to figure out, okay, what is your connection to this idea? So could have done a little better there, but still not necessarily a bad or incorrect thing to do. Okay, so he goes on here to, of course, describe and explain, like it says here, the network effect. So again, he actually makes a really strong claim at the beginning of this paragraph. So I'm going to make a new color here. The network effect characterizes our connections to each other in the digital sphere. So that's his claim. And in between here, you can see in the parenthetical, he actually defines the network effect, the digital web of contacts, pictures, videos, and posts. But this is still a very strong claim, right? And remember, M stands for main claim. In terms of social media, it has created a powerful cue. So another claim right here. It's created a powerful cue. And we know what that means, but someone who hasn't read The Power of Habit might not know what that means. A desire for distraction that draws us into an endless vortex of content. So he has another claim here, right? His claim is kind of continued throughout this section. Then he gets into what we would think would be evidence, but he actually kind of jumps into analysis, right? He's sort of giving us an example here, but it's also analysis. We see successful people posting pictures of the camaraderie they share on service projects or the fun times they have on the weekend at a party. So this is kind of an example analysis. And I think it's really quite well done, right? He's appealing to our experience through pathos. Remember, pathos is experience. It's not necessarily like an emotion or sadness or anything. It could be, right? But it's also just in general experience. So when overdone, the network effect is not benign. And then he gets into the evidence. A 2011 literature review found that it incorporates classic addiction symptoms such as mood modification, emotional preoccupation, tolerance as usage increases, withdrawal symptoms, and relapse. So he paraphrases evidence here, and I want to emphasize that it's paraphrased, but he still gives credit, okay? So remember that a key to paraphrasing effectively is to read, look away, then summarize. So that is the best way for you to avoid plagiarism, okay? Because if you don't, even if you do this parentheses, but it's word for word, you're still plagiarizing. So make sure it's in your own words. So then he goes into, as you can see, more analysis down here. He says, in the most addicted people, this desire to use social media is so ingrained that they feel the euphoric high that comes from the anticipation of sharing a buzzy message before it's even sent. So he ends with another piece of analysis / link, which directly connects back to his main claim up here. So I think that's the key, right? In any paragraph here, you want to kind of tie things up. So he talked here about the network effect. It characterizes our connections to each other in the digital sphere, and he actually ties that up again down here. So one thing that I do want to point out, kind of moving forward here, is he starts the next couple of paragraphs with questions. And I've talked to some of you guys about avoiding this, so look down here. But it's okay actually to use it as long as it's followed up by a claim. Okay, so the reason why I told some of you to avoid it is because you just started with a question and then answered it rather than starting with a claim. So he says, so how do we understand this addiction? For example, we're right here. He says, like toothbrushing and nail biting, using social media regularly is a habit. So that's a pretty strong claim, right? So he has a question, I'm just going to call that Q, and then a main claim. So that's one way to mix up the meal paragraph format, but he still includes a claim. Same thing down here. To change an addiction routine, you have to find out what your cue is and figure out how to get the same reward through a different response. Again, he does a question and then a main claim, right? And I do actually like the way that he does this. So what's the solution? because some of us might actually be asking ourselves that question as we read through this. So just something to consider. It's a style thing, right? So again, style, right? Starting off with a question, then a main claim. You still want to lead with your thoughts. Okay, that's a big thing that I've talked to a lot of you about. As long as you are leading with your ideas rather than someone else's, you're on the right track. It really does help to focus your paragraphs. Okay, so moving down here, so let's focus on this paragraph for a moment. So, like I said, he starts off with a question and then a main claim. And now he's giving an example. So he's getting into his evidence again, right? For example, my desire for a momentary distraction from the humdrum of everyday life makes me wander into the voyeurism of social media for the reward of relaxation. So this is a great tip for any of us when we're writing a paper, right? He gives his evidence that actually connects back to his introduction. So he connects to his anecdote, spell that right, in the intro, which can be quite effective. So, but recognizing that cue, I realized that calling a friend or reading a print book, for example, would also help me relax, avoiding the addiction to social media. So he gives some more evidence of how he actually changed that habit to prove to us, and almost even gaining his own credibility. So he's telling us, look, if I can do it, you can do it too, right? Then he says it's not easy, right? He recognizes that it's not an easy thing to do. So there's a little bit of analysis there. And then he gets into a recent study by Duke University researchers suggests that habits prime us to feed our cravings by leaving specific marks on our brains. Some more evidence. And then he links it back to the idea in the beginning, which is, what's the solution? It's certainly possible to change a habit through this step. So again, it links back to this idea that there is actually a solution and we can change our habits. So lots of things to think about in this example. I'm not going to read the entire thing. And again, he uses a style thing down here with a question. Does this sound like rehab? It should. So again, there's a question, and then he's got a main claim. So moving down here, of course, he does a really nice job of, putting together his evidence. He's got a variety of sources. I'm going to highlight that right here and write that down. Variety of source material is really important, especially in this third paper, where I'm not necessarily giving you a number, but 5 is probably not enough, okay, especially for an 8+ page paper. So finally, let's move down to where let's see here. So, of course, he acknowledges kind of the other side. In other words, advertisers are incentivized to keep us addicted because of their income is tied to time spent on these social media applications. So in this case, he's not really making a claim here. I mean, he sort of is, but he's kind of just giving us information, right? That, hey, I understand that this is happening. Social media apps and advertisers kind of have to get people addicted because that's how they make their money. And he says on average, most Facebook users are on the app 50 minutes a day, which correlates with its record-breaking net income of $1.5 billion in the first financial quarter of 2016, according to a New York Times article. So again, more evidence here. He's presenting us with his topic and then giving evidence. Okay. Then he says, if this the average amount of time, I think he meant if this is the average amount of time spent on Facebook, imagine how much time the most addicted users spend on the app. So in this sense, he's almost using logic here to make a point, right? Then he gets to, of course, his final proposal at the very end here. Let's see. So, and going back to this paragraph, sorry for the confusion. going back to this paragraph, he's kind of breaking our regular meal format. And again, I want to make the point to you guys that the meal paragraph format is a tool, right? It's not a rule. So while the meal paragraph format, you can find it in most paragraphs, you might have reason to break that, okay? And in general, the meal format helps you focus your argument, helps you focus on your claims, and it really helps to organize your thoughts and your ideas and reach your audience. Okay, so I just wanted to make that point as I analyze this. So now he gets into his final proposal, where he says, as individuals in a nation, we might support a congressional investigation or citizens commission to investigate the pernicious effects of social media addiction. So that's a pretty solid claim right there, right? And most of this paragraph, of course, he's already presented all of his evidence, so he's really just going to hone in on his proposal, right? What solution is he proposing? So we should also insist that businesses endorse the responsible use of their products. There may be a free market for our minds, so use of logic here. There may be a free market for our minds, but our national mental health must be preserved for the sake of productivity and sanity. So again, he's using logic to drive his point home. Then he makes a comparison here, right? We prosecute dealers who sell heroin or cocaine or prescription drugs on the street because of their dangerous potential for abuse. We need to rein in the power of social media for the same reason. So making a pretty powerful comparison here, which some actually could argue. You could argue that that's a little bit too far-fetched, or you could say, that actually is a really powerful thought. Because he did, if you remember his evidence earlier, suggested that social media is just as addictive as drugs. So as a society, we must not just focus on treating individuals, but also the whole system to adequately address this problem. So he's giving us an idea of what we actually should do. Without fear or favor, our government must examine now how we can take back our lives from social media, so we use it in moderation, not in excess. In the meantime, the causes of social media addiction, the habit sequence, so again, connecting back to his earlier evidence, cues, routines, and rewards, and the process of forming good habits must be taught in the workplace, school, and the home. When addicts are finally freed from the soft tyranny of their virtual feeds, they will be empowered to engage once again with the hard reality of the world around them. So again, this is another way to synthesize. Okay, if you bring up, you almost think of your sources as a thread going through your paper. So bringing it up again and again and again throughout your paper is a great way to utilize synthesis. And then he kind of leaves us with a pretty strong so what, right? So he even says, he uses the word addicts, right? When addicts are finally free from the soft tyranny of their virtual feed. So he's talking about people addicted to social media. So when this happens, they will be empowered to engage once again with the hard reality of the world around them. So he definitely leaves us with the so what. So he's letting us know that if we do this, we're going to be empowered. So I really like this paper. I think it's well put together. Of course, it's not perfect, as no, essay or piece of writing is. We can always criticize or find something to critique. But I want us to notice here also, okay, again, this is APA style, so don't pay attention to that or use this as a format for your citation style. But if I just go through and count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 11 sources. Now, is that exactly what you have to use on the third paper? No. But it's just something to think about. Okay, was he knowledgeable about his topic? I would say yes. So when you're thinking about how many sources you need for this third essay, think about how many you need to be able to talk with an expert. Now, I'm not saying you should be able to teach an expert, but you should be able to hold a conversation with someone who's an expert in your topic. So how many sources do you need to be able to talk with an expert? So I think I might have mentioned this to you guys before, but a good, I guess, guideline is that for every page in your paper, you should have a source, right? Now that's not to say you should have a source on every single page, but what I'm saying is for an 8-page paper, about 8 sources. That's a guideline, okay? And I'm going to say about 8 sources. So if you're someone who you're like, I just really need a number, then think about 8, okay? Or get as close to that as you possibly can. Okay, so with that said, you guys are going to have another assignment where you analyze another proposal. And the reason why we do this, of course, is to learn from other writers, okay? The paper that you guys are going to read, it's a lot shorter, but it's going to have quite a bit different style than this one. Perhaps not as much academic language, so keep that in mind because your particular paper is, of course, written to an academic audience. So keep that in mind as you do your